Okay, I'm going to create a new project. Our primary purpose of this project to understand what is preference manager. Only the preference manager. I'm not going to attach anything UI specific. And as I already told you, preference manager can save string, integers, number types, maybe double and all the stuff, and booleans, maybe mostly a primitive type data. See, naturally, string itself not a primitive, but I would say character is a primitive data, but mostly a primitive type of data a preference manager saves. And if at all anything indexing need comes, preference manager may not be a right choice, but still we can make in some other way, like converting a particular data into a JSON specific. JSON is a string, so naturally a preference manager can save the data. So that mechanism we already adapted in the previous exercise, but I'm just going to put a small exercise on how we can use the preference manager. There are various ways to do it. The last exercise we had created a file or Java file called utility.java. If you prefer that way, keeping the preference manager separately in a different class, that is also fine. Or if you want some other getter setter method, if you want to keep it, that is also fine. So let me create a new project. My screen is recording anyway. So I would recommend a unique name given. Due to some reason, Android doesn't prefer the word example. If you notice, my API level has got 4.xl preview. That's what I'm trying to say. I yet to receive the compatible 5.0 version, so it's still in a evolving stage. Maybe I can select the latest one, but I would recommend you select the KitKat, not the Wear. Wear is right now. Remember, Android also have a kind of Android watch, and they have a separate API release for it. If you buy, I hope a Samsung Galaxy Note comes with the Android watch as well. So the Android also pushes API separately for it. At the end of the program, we will see that additional thing, because these are all the evolving one. These things will get added at any point of time because Android is the evolving standard. So we will see that if you get a time. Otherwise, I would recommend you to keep the target SDK as of now 4.4. I may go ahead with the 4.x in order to enjoy the latest API, but I'm not going to use anything specifically. So as usual, we are not going to have any themes, and unchecking activity and launchers, and we get the Android project. Maybe in a vanilla standard, like it doesn't have any other add-ons or any app compatibility or anything else. So right now source is empty, we all know, and I'm going to keep the version 11 values folder. So I'm going to delete other folders. Maybe if at all required, we'll come back and add it. Okay. Keep an habit of verifying Android manifests every time. I usually practice this way. If at all my program doesn't respond, it gives me application not responding error, or ANR, or Android not responding, whatever it may be. I usually start my debugging from Android manifest. I immediately open verify whether that manifest has the entries of my activities or any service or broadcast receiver. So if everything fine out there, then I go and check the layout file, and if I feel everything is fine there, then I'll go and verify the Java file, of course the activity. And I somehow follow the commenting feature, like I comment code blocks in order to verify each block's work. And you have multiple ways also to in order to debug it. I want to cover the debugging section and other specific things connected to testing. Uh, we would like to, we may cover that in a JUnit testing. We have a separate session for it. So how to do a testing. So in that session, we will see how to debug the application, what are all the built-in features Eclipse have, and how to keep the, how to verify the particular line of code is executed or not. So those exercises we will see there. As of now, I may need to copy the package since I do not have anything defined in source. I'm going to create a class. So my activity TVT and the package name. Prefer to have the package same name defined in the Android manifest. Otherwise, I need to prefix the entire path. So giving it finish. Let me see if I can increase the font size. Oh my god. General editors. Text editors. Colors and fonts. I think it's to increase. As far as activity lifecycle, so we have to implement that on create method, and we have to have a layout defined for us in order to set content view. We have to do that, but before I register the particular activity in manifest, you can use this tool, otherwise you can directly attach the XML as we already know. Activity and the name. Since I define the package name directly over there, I can keep it like this. Otherwise, you can give the full path if your application path or your package is different than your activity file. And intent filter, you need to define whether it's a main activity and in order to register launcher, so we are defining so this is done. Let me go back and add a basic layout. Let me go ahead and add a linear layout. I find it a little simpler. So my activity okay, it's done. Now I can attach set content view. So for the best practice, we make sure run it on the emulator. Switching to DDMS, track it whether anything getting installed. Otherwise, yeah. Okay. Remember, my phone choice does not appear because my phone does not have Android 5.0 installed. That's the reason my phone did not appear here. But you can still, if you lower your, because that minimum and the target SDK and various stuff we have included, based on that it appears. So if you want to give a backward compatibility, you can slightly lower it. But of course, we are going to use a 4.4 only. So let me select it. Okay, so it seems to be fine here. In order to save a data in preference manager class in Android typically contains various helper methods in order to achieve a particular task. I was telling about SMS manager. Of course, it has some helper class in order to send SMS. So you can easily programmatically send an SMS from your application instead of going to SMS application composite. You can directly send a SMS using SMS manager helper classes. Like that, we have manager class in Android in order to give a particular specific helping or helper features. So preference manager is having couple of methods and classes in order to persist your data, and the persistency happens with a format something like key and value pairs. So every data is associated with a key. A key always a string, and the key and value pairs making sure when the user supplies the key, he gets back the equivalent whatever data associated with that particular key. So most of the Android objects you may have noticed, we use bundle object that also had a similar key value association, and we of course we use hash map object naturally, that is also a key value dependent. So you may see this kind of a data types quite often in Android development. It is pretty easy to handle it. I would recommend, if you are using such a data types, make sure the keys, or in other words, I'm saying whatever the string is going to be considered as a key, make it as a constant, define it somewhere so that you can easily access from that particular data, instead of you hard code everywhere. Hard coding may give you trouble as your application goes beyond to a particular, for example, if it goes to a complex type, naturally you'll have very hard time to find where the keys have been defined if you want to modify it. And if you make a mistake, naturally chances are very less to find the exact error. So but before I will explain just in a simplistic way, preference manager is a class, and it contains helpful or maybe helper methods in order to save your data. I need to get an instance of a preference manager one, and naturally actually I don't need an instance of preference manager. Actually, I need a preference manager one of helper method instance or helper class instance, that is called shared preferences. The name very clearly implies it is some preference data which is going to be shared across your activities. So it's exclusive for your application. Any activity, any service, or any broadcast system, or any other class you write can access this particular preference file and get the data from it. That's the reason the name is shared preference. But it need a context as an input, because it needs to know which particular class is accessing the shared preferences. A context, typically an instance of the class, maybe if it is an activity, so the instance of an activity. We have various contexts. One we call base context, another one we call application context. So base context, an instance of a activity itself. So naturally we refer it with the keyword this. So instance of the same class. If you want to get access of application content, which is having the instance of your whole application, so you can write it as a application context, but I would say that is a slightly heavyweight object. Wherever you use a base context, you can also use application context over there, because application context contains the base context also, but it has more other data types also attached to it, because application context is an instance of your whole application. If your application is so bigger, naturally the context size, the memory which is used for the application context will also be slightly higher. What is that? We will see. Preference manager, get default shared preferences. You may notice the choice appear: context, get application context, get base context. There are a couple of choices appear. You can choose either one. You can even choose a get application context. I told you application context is also contain the instance of your particular activity, so naturally that will also be accepted. Otherwise you can use get base context, naturally the instance of your particular activity. If not, you can use this, because this refers a class of activity, mean this particular class is of type activity, so this would be accepted as a context also. Remember, if it is an activity only, this will be accepted. If I remove it, naturally this will throw an error, because right now this refers just a basic class, it is not an activity. So it is not a context, it's not an index of instance of a context or application context anymore. So if you are using this, make sure you refer an activity. The class should have an activity instance, or it should be inherited from an activity typically. So I have to have it. Otherwise, I already told you, if you are not comfortable with the instance called this, you can make get base context. Both are same. I won't recommend application context, but that will also be accepted. But an application context is a heavyweight object, because it contains the instance of your whole application. Assume if your application is so bigger, it has a 15 activity classes, it has some 2 or 3 service class, it has a broadcast receiver and bunch of images. Consider if your application size itself goes about 5 MB or 10 MB. Handling get application context everywhere in your application will overload the memory consumption, because each time an application context is called, remember, an object, as far as an object oriented programming, it is the memory. The object resides in the memory. It occupies certain amount of memory before it works with the rest of the class or any other objects. So object consumption, even though Java handles it in with a improved built-in memory management, like a garbage collection, the various things are there, but we should avoid using heavyweight object for a better good developer. You may be getting a null pointer exception quite often as an error. Naturally, null pointer exception comes whether the object itself is not existing. Most of the time, notice developer making an error. They will just declare the object. They sometimes forget to initialize or do something in on create block. So naturally, those kind of an object does not occupy anything in the memory. Naturally, that's the reason null pointer exception means there is nothing in the memory. So if any object is created, assume a certain amount of memory is going to be used, and that should be within the limitation of what your Android is allows, because Android calculates the memory requirement based on your Android manifest file whatever you declare over it. For example, if it contains 10 to 15 activities, Android typically, if I want to say Dalvik virtual machine, which responsible for handling the memory, reads and calculate, okay, this much of memory this application may require, accordingly it gives a memory. It is everything done behind the screen. So making use of heavyweight object in the runtime, manifest only calculate a provisional memory, which may not be an accurate one. For example, if the application requires some 10 MB of memory, naturally manifest would have given some 12 MB of memory allocated for it. I mean, your Dalvik virtual machine. Suddenly, if you use get application context in a couple of times, it may heap. The memory would be, consume much beyond to a given or allotted memory. So these kind of errors or anything, your lack of performance, your application would become slightly sluggish. Those kind of thing would come if you use the heavyweight object. So for a better clarity, use the application context only when required. I don't see an application context as of course it required, but if required we will use it. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead with GetBaseContext or the keyword this. GetBaseContext would be accessible only inside the class where it is inherited something from activity. If it is something else, this GetBaseContext won't work, because it is GetBaseContext is a part of a class activity. So you can use both this or GetBaseContext. This means it should refer a class which is inherited from an activity class. Okay. So now I've initialized the shared preference, and right now my shared preferences object is ready. Initially, shared preferences gives you a only read-only access unless you call specific helper method called edit. That will only give you a read-only access. So naturally, whatever data is there, you can read it from it. I already told you, in order to get or set the data, I need a certain strings. Especially, I'm calling it keys. So I'm going to retrieve a string. If you notice, get string, get float, get in, get long, get string set is similar to a kind of array specific. But if you notice, only few data types allowed in order to be saved in the preference manager. So particularly, I'm going to use a string, some name a key. When you call a preference manager, when you try to read a value, chances are there the value is not existing in the memory or it is already existing. So these two conditions, if you encounter, chances are there this particular application may get exception errors. In order to avoid it, preference manager, when you try to get a string, it asks you a default value. The default value will be retrieved only when there is no value exist. Right now I'm writing freshly, so naturally the A key won't be there. So when there is no value for the A key, associated, it will read from a default value. So I can type like this. It means if there is no value, pick the value from here. Okay. Let me put a toast here. I may use a toast quite often, so let me write it as a I don't need to explain this, I hope, because we've been using the toast quite long. So almost all the exercise we have this toast covered. So I'm going to display this particular value. Now if I run the code, what will be the output? What I will get? What I will get? I will get a toast message. I know what message I will get. Okay, it means in the beginning of my application, on create is called, of course I know, and it is setting a content, that everything is fine. In on create, I have a object created called SharedPreferences SP from a preference manager, helper, methods, and classes. And I have an instance of SharedPreference, and SharedPreference have another method called getString, and from the getString I try to retrieve a key, a value of a key. So I supply the key here, I try to get the value. Chances are there is no key or particular values never exists. At that time it is going to call from my default value. So naturally I'm going to get this output, which is an expected behavior. So my default value just appears. Now I'm going to close it. Now if I reopen my application, what will be the message? What will be the message? I'm going to reopen my application. What will be the message? I'll get the same. Because first point, the very first time when I ran the application, there was no value associated with the key. So what it would have done is, okay, logcat, where is the logcat? Okay, so I haven't put anything on the log statement. The very first time this particular line executed, it was looking for a key called a key, but it wouldn't have found a value for it. So now it would have attached this particular value with this key. So right now the preference is going to retrieve what is the value attached to this particular key is the default one until I modify it. Since I put it in the on create block, this will be called every time an application is closed and reopened. If I pause it and open it again, I'm not going to get anything because it has been written in the on create. So make sure you hit back, if you want to get the toast message. Now I'm going to get an instance of an editor. I'm going to get the read and write access to my preference manager. I'm going to give it name ed. Same thing, preference manager. At the end you need to call edit, and now you have a read and write access to a preference manager. So now I'm going to change the value of a key. You need to write exactly same, since I'm not using any constants. I need to again call the same way in order to retrieve the string. Now if I run the application, what will be my output? Pardon? No. y. Yeah, this is very important step. A change has to be committed in order to take effect. So the value which you have, for example, instance which you have a write access, if you are attempting to change a value of a particular key, make sure at the end you commit the changes. That's the reason. So you need to commit, otherwise the change won't take effect. One. Now, if you are modifying particular value, you have to give the same key name. Chances are there I will make a mistake like this. When I type the code quite rushingly, I will make a spelling mistake. Of course, naturally, any developer can make a mistake. So, in order to avoid these kind of errors, because I need to know which value I supplied for a particular key, and the same key I need for in order to retrieve the value also. But a developer may make a mistake at one point of time and suddenly he may not be getting expected behavior, chances primarily due to a spelling mistakes or anything hard coded value. In order to avoid that only, I made use of a constant. The behavior, the value cannot be altered, one benefit. Another one, I can easily reuse it anywhere instead of every time I hard code the value. For that benefit, I added a constant. Sorry. In order to understand whether it's going to be a constant or not, so of course I gave you a better practice section. I gave a hint like keep a all uppercase letter for a constant and give the same. Now I can use this one instead of wherever I need to use the particular key. Now chances of making mistake is very less because I know it is defined well outside and defined as a constant, and naturally wherever I refer the same key would be coming here. So for that purpose we are using the constants. Don't wonder in saying that hey, same thing and equivalently have given the same value. It just need a string, that's it. A string has to be supplied as a key. A string can be any value or anything. So in this case I have given a key. Tomorrow it may be a roll number or anything else. So it's for our referential purpose in order to avoid errors. Okay, now let me run it. I have two toast, so a value modified. First line, the order was very clear. The first toast appeared as a my default value because it was executing this particular line. That time there was no value modified, so naturally it brought the default value. But now editor has made changes to this particular string, a particular value associated with the key, which is now called a value modified, and it committed the changes. So naturally the reattempt to read the same key, of course I need to modify here also, gave me a modified value. See, in this case it did not read this particular value, my default value, because the editor has modified. Now I am going to run the code. What's the output I will get? Now I am going to run the code. Modified value, why? Yeah, so the previous execution made the changes of a particular key, and since it is a persistent one, the changes is permanent. So the changes already took effect, so the preference right now may have a different value. So right now, trying to read a particular value associated with this key will give me a modified value. It won't read the default value. That's pretty straightforward. I already gave another hack in order to verify your shared preferences exist. So make sure you go to DDMS and select the file explorer and make sure your emulator is selected, and there is a folder data and data of course twice, and see your package name. If you see a folder called shared preferences or something similar, you can see a file created for you, and it has some sort of KB size. I can pull that file in order to see what is the last value updated. So there is two icons, small icons if you notice. One is pull a file from a device. So I'm going to take that file out and going to save it in my desktop. Now I can open the file. If you see it, it's just a similar, what we say, XML standard strings folder, similar to it. It has a string name, the key what I created, and if you notice the value, right now a modified value is there. So naturally it is going to be displayed. So if you notice, this particular XML has a map, root node. Root node is having a map, and inside a string and a key value pairs if it is looking like. Preference manager can create a map values. For example, it can be a group of value or individual value. So if you want to treat it as array, that also you can make a use of it. But I won't recommend that standard. But still, what you need to understand, a preference manager is mainly in order to save a key value pair specific data, mostly a primitive data specific, a number or a character. A group of characters string, a number, we have various type of numbers in Java, integer, float, double on various number systems. So those are of course Boolean. So those kind of data can be associated like this. So if I notice right now a key has a value called a value modified. Naturally any attempt to call the particular shared preferences will have this value only unless it is modified. As long as this file is there, your application will have the data persisted. Since it is the emulator, you are getting access to these folders. In a real device, you will have a very hard time to retrieve. This is my real device. See, if I try to access my Motorola phone, try to access the data folder, I won't have any access to read it. The only emulator gives you a folder level access. Other than that, this is very secured one. Fine. So what's the output if I run this code? Pardon? A modified value, of course, whatever the changes being done will be there. A value modified, whatever is there. So in this exercise we understood shared preferences try to connect the data with a key. So it is a key value pair, one. And shared preferences initially gets a read-only access, or naturally try to retrieve the data, whatever the value a key you supply. First time when it is retrieved, the particular key and value may not exist. So that time only it will pick the value from whatever you specified in get string, whatever default you specified, it will be retrieved from it. It will be retrieved, of course, it will be created with the default value. After subsequent changes with the help of editor, we'll make sure the particular key value pairs is modified. Of course, key remains same, the value is getting modified, and naturally any attempt to access the particular data associated with the key, you will always get a latest or the last updated one. And this is how the preference manager works. It is nothing but a simple file system created in your application folder itself. So that file keeps your all data. It is similar to a strings.xml, and naturally retrieve the data from there. It is very simple and it is safe, secure. Maybe we will have indexing issues if the data goes much bigger, but other than that, this is pretty fine. If you want to have a particular user preferences, for example, I told you setting a yes or no, maybe keeping a ringtone on or off, or some sort of feature you want to give the user, those kind of preferential choices can be kept it here. That's the reason it's a preference manager. So since I have written as a separate exercise, I wrote everything in onCreate, but we need to write our code in a modular approach. I always say that you need to write in a modular approach, means once you write, it should be reusable. So that's the whole benefit of using object-oriented programming. So we have to keep the particular functions and methods in order to reuse it wherever it is required. If you notice the few steps back, even I can go back. In this particular example, the shared preferences, once it is initialized, if you notice these two lines repeated. Here I write, and again also I am writing it. This is not a good thing for a professional developer. Repeat the same code again and again. Instead, you can keep it as a separate class or somewhere, reuse it wherever required, or make it as a separate method and reuse it wherever required. So easiest fix maybe for this, I would have created a function called setValue. Is getValue. I could have created as a separate method for it, so I don't need it. Instead, I can call it is getValue, so we don't need any. So I could have used it twice. So I don't need to repeat the block. Instead, I could have simply called the same method twice. So first time it would have written a default value if it doesn't exist, and second time it will modify, and third time it will get me an updated value. So this is one small modular approach. But your application may have various classes, especially various activity UI elements. So I prefer to create a separate class for it. So kept all the preference specific, constant specific in a different class. That's the reason in the previous exercise I had a class called utility.java. There I kept it. So that way it will become more robust and you can easily use it, or even if I can take a copy of it and put it in a different project also, because my project, each and other, maybe every project will have a similar requirement. So a requirement to keep a modular approach is very important for a professional developers, and keeping everything organized makes your code more powerful. and which will eventually make your development quite faster. If I get a time, I will discuss about various methodologies, of how to handle the development. That also I'll explain. But comes under a slightly advanced level. But those things you will get to know it when you put into a deployment stage, or when you put into a projects. Typically, your manager would train you. But if not, you will see the overview of how a typical development would be in big corporates, on what way they follow the standard. So most of the exercises I try to adapt the same standard. So right now I am going to add one more way in order to keep a modular approach. So I'm going to create a separate class for it. Last time I gave a name utility, so because I feel it is a reusable one, name having a utility helps me to remember it. Various ways to do it. You can make it as a simple class with a constructor in place. Constructor, as we know, is the same name of your class and doesn't have any return value. I've written as looking like it's a getter setter method, but it is I'm writing exclusive for preference manager. And this is one of the approach. Maybe one approach we already saw in the previous exercise. This is another approach. So I'm going to keep the set get value. Toast I don't need it. Toast maybe I'll keep it a little later. Help me move the constants from there to here, because it will be appropriate to keep it in a different class. So I'm going to keep the constants here. Still, of course, right now the GetBaseContext won't work because it is just a class. Only an activity can have access to a GetBaseContext. So I need a instance of a base context in order to use it. I can get it from a constructor. Otherwise, you make it as this base context, whatever. Just to say it is a global one. I mean, keep the same name to be. It means this dot base context refers this global private object. Without one with a prefix this it gets from a argument. When there is a same name exists, you can make use of this as well. Otherwise, it entirely give a Fine. So I've got the instance of a context like this, and now I can point it this way. Instead of this one, I'm going to make it as a string type, which will return. And setting same, copy it. So with the small changes, with the help of a set and get methods, so I can read and write it. I can send the update value as an argument, and I have a context called from a constructor. So if I put into use this particular code, of course I'm not going to need this. Remember, this exercise, it has a constructor, so I cannot statically call the method. The previous one does not have a constructor. Of course, the methods had a static keyword prefix here, but right now it is not a static method. So now I need to make an instance. So utility, new utility with this. Now the constructor will be injected from your activity. This constructor is getting an instance of your context, and that context will come here, and this context will be made global for the two methods, and naturally the context of your activity is injected in this way. And now set value something, I'll put it. Now I can get a display toast of a latest one. Display message utility KeyValue with 3 lines of code. First I'm getting a initialization block, of course. So I initialize with the context because I need to send the context inside. So I initialize with the particular object which is initialized right now is called utility. From the utility, one of a method sets a value to a preference manager. Remember, I encapsulated the preference manager object. The preference manager object doesn't exist here because it is encapsulated inside. We don't give any access. Of course, I can even modify in a much better way to benefit of encapsulation. So in this case, your context and your editor and shared preferences values have been encapsulated. I don't need access to a context because the context is there in the argument itself. I can remove it now safely. This particular block itself not needed because in the constructor itself the context would be called. So ed and sp is right now encapsulated. Remember encapsulation, it will have this object will be private. the object cannot be called from a external classes. So I can use a getter and setter method in order to set the value, get the value and set the value. Getter method, setter method is obviously the name convention. It is not something like you should follow this way alone. Usually developer follow a get value or get or set value, something like that they will set. So in order to see it's an encapsulated one, it is a getter setter method as well. So right now the editor and the shared preferences instances have been encapsulated. I only give exposure through the set and get methods. The set method uses the editor in order to save the value, but of course it doesn't expose the editor outside. And similarly, get value doesn't expose the shared preference instance outside, but still get the value from the shared preference. So using this way, I can make a small utility function, entirely hide the persistent manager behind the screen, and I can simply expose it using set and get functions, save the value, retry the value. This is one approach. If you like this approach, you can make use of it. The last exercise I had a slightly similar approach, but I used static methods because I did not have any setter getter at that time. My requirement was not that level, so I had a static method itself, and in that each method every time I have access to a context also supplied. So if you notice the previous exercise, let me clear all the imports of this example. Shopping list version 2, I remember we had a thing defined in a separate package. If you notice, similar approach, but the difference was there was no constructor, and I used a static method in order to avoid any instance or anything else, because at that point I felt I don't want to explain this approach. So I use a setter getter, similar thing. Now if you see save list, get list, so set get, the convention has come here. In every function I had to get access to a context, otherwise I cannot access the shared preference. So the context was called every time. That's the reason I can simply use a static method. By instead of having a new keyword, I can simply call the class name dot the method itself. This is another approach. If you like this, you can make use of this as well. But only problem may be unless you don't have much problem with using static methods, this approach is fine. But if you some developer feel using a static method is a kind of a scenario where the value could modified by other sources simplistic way, but at this point, since it is everything based on the editor and shared preferences, I didn't feel any much of a potential violation of using an object. That's why I use a static method. Otherwise, if you don't want to use static methods, you can follow the last exercise, this exercise. So in this case, editor and shared preferences, the context has set in the constructor itself. Only roundabout way is I need to initialize the utility class, otherwise I cannot access it. Whereas in the previous exercise, instead of initializing, I simply called a utility. I can put a dot, I can simply call it up. But now I had to initialize. The constructor is injected only once, and I can anywhere in the class I can make use of set and get methods. So this is one of the way of saving the persistence. So whatever approach is better for you, you can make use of it. If you like this way, yes, you can use it. Otherwise, the previous one, you can make use of it. Now your code is a slightly modified so that I can easily access the shared preferences. Instead of every time initialize shared preferences, preference manager, get default shared preference instance. Right now everything encapsulated inside a setter getter method. So this is one of a way. So if at all you are using preference manager, I would recommend using this way. That's the reason I created a separate class and kept it in different packages, because I am going to extend some helper methods. I feel those methods would be required to be called every time. Instead of every time make an instance of a shared preference or editor and make it save it, I don't need to do it here. I can simply make use of this one. Okay, so I hope up to this point you have some good clarity on how the preference manager works. Preference manager is a key value pairs saved in a XML file put into your application folder itself. It doesn't exist anywhere, it is there in your application folder itself. Since it's a key value pair, we need a key, and in our example we use a key, a string, as a constant, and as many as key as that many as value you can save it. And this exercise we used a utility class. We had a getter setter method and hiding the instance of editors and preference shared preference objects, and eventually only exposing it only through a set and get methods, and that gave us a easiest way of accessing the persistent storage. So that's the thing of course I used in the previous exercise, but a lot of you felt okay it is going slightly complex way because I put everything into working in one example itself. Instead, today I decided to go ahead and explain the preference manager alone and its practices. So I hope next you practice this, only shared preferences, these things. Use a utility, the previous one and the new one. Practice it. Test it with the various instance of your emulator and make sure you always get up to date value. Make sure you verify in the file explorer, check your values and whatever values instructor or whatever the value is there present. After the break I will explain what is JSON. Then we eventually go back to our previous exercise and we will continue the shopping list version 2. Okay, any questions?